My name is Harper, and I am 31 years old. 2 days ago, I sat in a high-rise law office and watched my mother and sister inherit $1.2 million and a four-bedroom colonial home. Then, the estate attorney slid a tarnished, heavy wooden box across the mahogany table toward me. My sister actually laughed out loud. My mother leaned back in her leather chair and told the room that a box of old dirt was the perfect inheritance for a daughter who spent her life dusting off other people's trash. They walked out of that office popping champagne, convinced they had left me with nothing. They had no idea they had just handed me a $4 million royal artifact. Before I tell you what was hidden inside the false bottom of that box, let me know your age and where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe to Sweet Karma Life if your family has ever treated you like a second-class citizen when money was involved. Trust me, you will want to hear how they reacted when they saw my ugly little box on the national news. Now, let me take you back to the moment the lawyer broke the seal on Grandmother Beatrice's will. The air in the room was stale, smelling of floor wax and old paper. My mother, Patricia, and my younger sister Chloe sat shoulder to shoulder on the plush sofa across from me. They were practically vibrating. Chloe kept tapping her manicured nails against her phone screen. Patricia had worn a tailored black suit, playing the grieving daughter, but her eyes kept darting to the thick stack of papers on the attorney's desk. The lawyer cleared his throat and began reading. Grandmother Beatrice was a meticulous woman. She outlined everything. The liquid assets, held primarily in tax-deferred retirement accounts and mutual funds, totaled just over $1.2 million. The deed to the sprawling colonial house in the suburbs was fully paid off. The lawyer read the distribution clearly. Patricia and Chloe were named the primary equal beneficiaries of the wealth and the real estate. Chloe clapped her hands together. A sharp, loud sound that echoed in the quiet office. Patricia patted her knee, smiling a tight, victorious smile in my direction. They had spent years positioning themselves for this exact moment. They viewed my grandmother not as a person, but as a waiting payout. Then the lawyer reached down into a cardboard storage bin beside his desk. He lifted out an object and set it on the mahogany table. It was a dark, heavy wooden box, maybe 10 inches wide, bound in brass that had turned green with age. The wood was dull, scratched, and thick with decades of accumulated dust. He pushed it across the smooth surface. It stopped right in front of me. The lawyer looked down at his notes and stated that Beatrice had explicitly designated this item and its contents solely to her eldest granddaughter, Harper. The room went silent for a fraction of a second before Chloe let out a scoff. She picked up her designer purse and stood up. Patricia stood next, smoothing the front of her jacket. She looked down at the box, then up at me. She said it made sense. She said I was a certified antique appraiser, so dealing with forgotten junk was my specialty. She told me to enjoy the memories, turned on her heel, and walked out the door with Chloe right behind her. I could hear them planning a celebratory dinner before the elevator doors even closed. I sat alone in the office. I did not cry. I did not argue. I reached out and placed my hands on the cold, green brass corners of the box. As an appraiser, my job is to look past the surface. I felt the dense weight of the wood. I saw the deliberate construction of the hinges. Grandmother Beatrice knew exactly what she was doing. She knew Patricia would contest any will that gave me a dime of the cash. She knew they were blinded by instant gratification. They saw an ugly box. I saw a puzzle left behind by the only woman who ever truly understood me. The drive back to my apartment takes 45 minutes, but time feels suspended. The box sits on the passenger seat of my 10-year-old Subaru. The heater is on, blowing warm air over the wood. The scent of aged cedar, dormant for decades, fills the cabin. It mixes with the metallic tang of oxidized brass. Every time I take a turn, the heavy box shifts slightly against the upholstery. I reach over and keep my right hand resting on the smooth, worn top lid. It grounds me. It reminds me I am no longer sitting in that law office, breathing in the stale air of their entitlement. My phone buzzes in the cup holder. The screen lights up with a text from Patricia. It is not an apology. It is a demand. She wants to know when I can come over to the Colonial House to help pack up Beatrice's belongings. She mentions that Chloe wants the master bedroom repainted before she moves her things in, and they need me to patch the drywall this weekend. I do not reply. I let the screen fade to black. For 31 years, this was my designated role. I was the family utility. A human tool meant to be stored in the shed until a pipe burst, a tire went flat, or a check needed to be written. I paid my own way through State College by working late shifts at a restoration warehouse, sanding down antique furniture until my fingertips bled and my lungs tasted like sawdust. I built my appraisal business from the ground up, client by client, authenticating estate sales and cataloging forgotten heirlooms for strangers who respected my expertise more than my own blood relatives ever did. Patricia never attended my business launch. She was too busy co-signing a lease for Chloe. Chloe was 28, a woman who treated employment like a seasonal hobby. She never held a job for more than 6 months. She would quit a marketing agency because the lighting in the office gave her a headache, or walk out of a boutique management position because her supervisor expected her to arrive on time and actually work. Yet Chloe always drove a pristine, current-year luxury sedan. The monthly payments were quietly handled by the Bank of Mom. Patricia structured our entire family ecosystem around shielding my sister from the friction of the real world. Whenever Chloe overdrafted her account after a weekend trip to Miami or a designer shopping spree, Patricia would call me. She would frame it as a temporary emergency. She would cite family loyalty, demanding I wire funds to cover Chloe's rent so she would not face eviction. If I refused, I was branded selfish, cold, and ungrateful. If I agreed, the money vanished into Chloe's bottomless appetite for status symbols, never to be seen again. Grandmother Beatrice watched all of this from her reading chair in the sunroom. She was a woman of few words, but her silence was never passive. It was analytical. When I was younger, I would sit on the woven rug in her study while she cleaned her collection of silver and porcelain. She handed me a magnifying loupe one afternoon and pointed to a silver teapot. She told me to read the hallmarks stamped into the base. She explained that anyone could polish a piece of cheap tin and make it shine under a bright light. But provenance, the true origin and history of an object, cannot be faked. The marks of the maker, the scars of time, the weight of the material. You just have to know where to look. Beatrice applied the same rigorous appraisal to people. She saw right through Patricia's performative parenting and Chloe's manufactured fragility. She recognized that my mother used my stability to subsidize my sister's chaos. She knew exactly what would happen the moment her heart stopped beating and the estate was divided. If Beatrice had left me a trust fund or a percentage of the liquid assets, it would have painted a massive target on my back. Patricia would have relentlessly weaponized guilt, fabricated family duties, and manufactured emergencies to siphon those funds directly into Chloe's pockets. The inheritance would have become a lifelong tether, dragging me down into their endless cycle of debt and bailout. I would have spent the rest of my life fighting them in court or defending my bank accounts. So, Beatrice did not leave me money. She left me a test, a final brilliant maneuver designed to bypass the scavengers. She disguised her greatest gift as garbage. I pull into the alleyway behind my appraisal studio. The neighborhood is quiet, industrial, defined by brick buildings and wrought iron fire escapes. It is a space I own, a sanctuary built on facts, history, and verifiable truth. I carry the heavy wooden box up the concrete stairs to the second floor. I unlock the reinforced steel door, disarm the security system, and throw the deadbolt behind me. The heavy metallic click of the lock echoing in the empty hallway is the sound of a boundary being drawn. My studio smells of linseed oil, binding glue, and old paper. Workbenches line the walls, covered in specialized lighting, magnification tools, and reference texts. It is an environment designed solely for uncovering secrets and establishing value. I set the tarnished box down on the central examination table. I turn on the overhead halogen lamps. The harsh, bright light washes over the scratched wood and the green brass corners. Under the glare, it looks even more unremarkable. It looks exactly like the piece of junk Patricia and Chloe believed it to be. But as I lean in closer, sliding my jeweler's loop over my right eye, the details begin to emerge. The brass fittings are not stamped metal. They are hand-cast, showing the tiny imperfections of a centuries-old mold. The wood grain is tight, heavy, characteristic of old-growth timber that has not been available for over 150 years. My phone buzzes again on the metal table. It is Chloe this time. She leaves a voicemail complaining that the estate lawyer will not release the liquid funds for another week due to standard probate processing. She says she needs $500 immediately to secure a reservation for her celebratory vacation in Tulum. She actually says into the phone that I owe her a favor since she let me keep the old box without putting up a fight. I delete the voicemail without finishing it. Let her figure out her own flight. I trace my fingers along the bottom edge of the brass-bound box. There is a slight, almost imperceptible seam in the wood. It is a secondary panel. A false bottom. Beatrice knew I would not just put this item on a dusty shelf. She knew I would investigate its structure. The tension in my chest tightens as I reach for a specialized micro spatula from my velvet-lined toolkit. I am standing on the edge of a revelation, and the women who threw this box at me are currently arguing over paint colors in a house they cannot afford to maintain. I slip the thin steel edge into the hidden seam, feeling for the internal catch that will change the trajectory of my entire life. I press the thin steel edge of the microspatula into the microscopic seam at the base of the tarnished box. The metal tool is cold against my thumb. The studio is silent, except for the low hum of the overhead halogen lamps and the distant rumble of a delivery truck on the street outside. I do not rush. Rushing destroys history. It is a lesson my mother never learned, but one my grandmother engraved into my mind. I apply steady, calculated pressure to the wood, feeling for the internal mechanism. My mother and sister operate on impulse. If they want something, they take it. If a problem arises, they demand someone else fix it. They lack the discipline required to look beneath the surface of anything, whether it is a financial portfolio or a piece of forgotten antique furniture. Beatrice understood this flaw perfectly. She weaponized their shallowness against them. Under the pressure of my tool, a sharp metallic click echoes in the quiet room. The hidden spring catch releases. I slide the false bottom outward. It moves smoothly along hidden brass tracks that have not seen the light of day in decades. Beneath the dusty, unremarkable exterior of the 19th century tea caddy lies a secondary compartment lined in faded crimson velvet. Resting in the center of that velvet is an object that defies logic. My breath catches sharply, trapped in my throat. The cold, clinical detachment I have maintained for a decade instantly shatters. I can physically feel my pulse hammering against my temples, a rapid, heavy thudding that drowns out the low hum of the halogen lamps. I pull a pair of white cotton examination gloves from my drawer and attempt to slide them onto my hands. My fingers are trembling so violently I miss the fabric. I have to stop, close my eyes, and clench my hands into tight fists, digging my nails into my palms just to force the adrenaline down and regain basic motor control. I reach down and lift the item from its resting place. The sheer density of it is shocking. It is a solid gold cylindrical seal, roughly 3 inches tall. The craftsmanship is staggering. The gold is not smooth. It is intricately chased and engraved with a sweeping, ornate floral motif. Set into the heavy gold matrix are dozens of flawless old mine-cut diamonds and deep red rubies that catch the harsh halogen light, fracturing it into brilliant shards of color across my workbench. I reach for my jeweler's loop. My hand is shaking so badly that the brass casing rattles against the aluminum table before I can grip it. I take a ragged breath, finally squeezing the loop into my right eye socket. I lean directly under the brightest bulb and turn the base of the seal toward the light. I need to see the maker's marks. I need undeniable proof of what I am holding. I scan the underside of the heavy gold base, looking past the intricate crest carved into the stamping surface. There, near the rim, stamped deep into the precious metal, is a tiny, distinct hallmark, a crowned fleur-de-lis next to a master goldsmith's initials. I pull back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I recognize the hallmark from my advanced studies in European antiquities. I am holding a French royal seal dating back to the late 18th century, specifically the reign of King Louis XVI. These items are considered ghosts in the appraisal world. During the chaos of the French Revolution, the Republicans confiscated royal assets. Almost every solid gold item belonging to the monarchy was melted down to fund the new government's armies. Artifacts like this simply do not exist outside of national museums in Paris. For one to surface in a dusty commercial studio in America is nothing short of a miracle. The historical significance is profound. The financial value is dizzying. I place the seal gently back onto the crimson velvet. I pull the loupe from my eye and stare at the wall of my studio, trying to process the magnitude of the trap Grandmother Beatrice just executed. She bypassed the American probate system entirely. In our legal system, an estate's liquid assets, real estate, and major investments are subjected to rigorous taxation and inventory. If Beatrice had left me a known multi-million-dollar asset, the estate attorney would have been required to document it. My mother would have hired her own legal team the very next morning to contest the will, claiming she deserved a percentage of the value. She would have tied me up in civil court for a decade, bleeding me dry with legal fees until I was forced to sell the artifact just to pay the lawyers. Instead, Beatrice left me a plain wooden box. She listed it in her will as a simple household heirloom. She knew my mother would view it as an insult and eagerly waive her legal right to it on paper, securing my ownership before anyone understood its true worth. Right now, 10 miles away, Patricia and Chloe are likely standing in the foyer of Grandmother's colonial house, measuring the windows for custom silk drapes they cannot afford. I can picture Chloe demanding the master's suite, complaining about the outdated wallpaper. I can see Patricia nodding along, calculating how much she can borrow against the equity of the house to fund a kitchen renovation. They are reveling in their perceived victory, blinded by the immediate gratification of $1 million in cash and a piece of suburban real estate. They believe they hold all the power. They believe they have relegated me to the role of the impoverished outcast daughter. They have no idea I am staring at a museum-grade masterpiece worth more than their entire inheritance combined. But the initial shock of the discovery quickly fades, replaced by a cold, hard realization. The conflict has just shifted dramatically. I am sitting alone in a commercial district with a priceless, uninsured royal artifact sitting on an aluminum table. My security system is good, but it is designed to protect standard antique jewelry and vintage watches, not historic national treasures. I cannot keep it here. I cannot take it to my apartment. I need to secure it, authenticate it through official channels, and arrange a private transport to a major auction house. I have to move in total silence. The clock is officially ticking. It is only a matter of weeks before my mother and sister burn through their readily available cash. Once the reality of property taxes, estate fees, and their own reckless spending catches up with them, they will start looking for new resources to drain. They will come looking for me, expecting the dutiful, reliable scapegoat to bail them out of the financial grave they are currently digging. I need to build an impenetrable fortress around this artifact and my future before they realize the bank is empty. The first thing I did the following morning was run a secure, climate-controlled vault at a private facility across town. I placed the royal seal inside a biometric travel case, locked it in the steel drawer, and swallowed the key. Metaphorically speaking. The artifact was safe. Now, the waiting game began. Over the next 3 weeks, I watched from a distance as my family began to hemorrhage cash. They did not just spend Grandmother Beatrice's estate, they wore it like a weapon. To understand the sheer scale of their financial recklessness, you have to understand how Patricia viewed wealth. Growing up, our household was a theater production of suburban success. We had leased luxury cars in the driveway while the electricity was routinely shut off. Patricia believed that wealth was a costume you put on to impress the neighbors. She taught Chloe that perception was reality. If you looked rich, people treated you like you were rich. The actual numbers in the bank account were just an afterthought. Now, For the first time in their lives, they had access to genuine capital. But they lacked the financial literacy required to maintain it. The probate process in the United States is slow. It is a deliberate legal mechanism designed to ensure all debts, taxes, and final expenses are paid before the beneficiaries see a single dime. The estate lawyer had released a minor fraction of the liquid funds to cover immediate funeral costs and basic maintenance on the colonial house. The bulk of the $1.2 million was still locked behind court proceedings and pending tax assessments. Patricia did not care about the legal timeline. She wanted her victory lap immediately. Because grandmother Beatrice had smartly filed a transfer on death deed for the colonial house years ago, the property bypassed probate entirely and transferred directly into Patricia's name. It was the only asset she physically and legally controlled, while the $1.2 million in cash remained frozen in the courts. So, she walked into a local bank and leveraged it. She took out a staggering home equity line of credit against the fully paid-off house. She assumed the mutual funds would clear any day, making the loan a temporary bridge to her new affluent lifestyle. The moment the funds hit their joint account, the facade of grieving relatives vanished. Chloe purchased a brand-new current-year luxury SUV. She did not lease it. She bought it outright using the borrowed home equity funds. She wanted the title in her name so she could post photos holding the keys. Patricia began booking back-to-back luxury river cruises through Europe, upgrading to the premier suites and securing first-class flights. They hired contractors to gut the master bathroom in the colonial house, demanding imported marble and custom fixtures. They were spending imaginary money, drawing from a well they had not actually secured yet. My phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at my workbench, carefully calibrating a high-definition macro lens on my digital camera. The studio was completely silent, the air still and heavy with absolute concentration. I needed perfect lighting to capture the microscopic inclusions of the old mine-cut diamonds. I hit the speakerphone button and kept my eyes glued to the camera monitor. Chloe's voice shattered the quiet. The audio from the speaker was chaotic, a blast of heavy, pulsing pop music layered over the aggressive roar of a high-performance engine. The wind was violently whipping through her open car windows, distorting her voice. She practically yelled over the noise, sounding breathless and dripping with the arrogant thrill of her new, unearned luxury SUV. She bragged about doing 90 on the interstate, completely intoxicated by her own perceived status. Patricia shrieked a laugh from the passenger seat, the sharp sound crackling over the phone. She yelled over the wind, asking what I was doing, locked away in my depressing little cave. I didn't blink. I made a micro adjustment to the lens aperture, bringing a flawless 2-century-old ruby into razor-sharp focus on my screen. I told them, my voice flat and completely unbothered, that I was cataloging an item. Chloe let out a loud, theatrical cackle that pierced right through the heavy bass of her car stereo. She asked how much I charged to dust off old garbage. She then paused, turning down the music just enough to shift her tone into a manufactured, condescending pity. She said she knew things were probably tight for me, considering I walked away from the will reading with nothing but a dirty wooden box. She offered to lend me a few $100s to help cover my rent for the month. She made sure to specify it was a loan, not a gift. Patricia added that they could drop off some leftover catering from their renovation celebration party if I was hungry. They wanted me to beg. They wanted me to express jealousy, to validate their triumph by showing my defeat. They needed my suffering to make their success feel real. I stared at the high-resolution image on my monitor. The screen displayed a flawless ruby, cut over 2 centuries ago by a master jeweler for a king. The gemstone was worth more than the car Chloe was currently driving. I kept my voice flat, devoid of any inflection. I thanked them for the offer but declined. I told them I had everything I needed. Chloe scoffed, calling me stubborn. She told me to have fun playing with my dusty box and hung up. The studio fell silent again. I felt a cold, sharp satisfaction settle in my chest. Their hubris was blinding them to reality. Every time they mocked my inheritance, they confirmed their own ignorance. I spent the next several days building an impenetrable fortress of documentation. I drafted a comprehensive provenance report, tracing the potential journey of the seal from the French royal court to my grandmother's possession. I utilized encrypted communication channels to contact the head of European antiquities at a premier auction house in New York. I sent them a secure file containing only a fraction of the macro photographs, obscuring the primary hallmarks, but showing enough craftsmanship to prove the item's era and quality. I was laying the groundwork for a generational shift in wealth. I was dealing in historical facts, legal ownership, and international markets. Meanwhile, my mother and sister were treating an uncleared estate like a limitless ATM. They did not realize that by taking out a massive loan against the house, they had made themselves personally liable for the debt. They did not calculate the impending property taxes, which would be reassessed at the current market value. They did not factor in the federal and state inheritance taxes that were silently accruing on the mutual funds they had not even touched yet. They were accelerating down a highway with no brakes, oblivious to the fact that the road ended in a brick wall. The probate period was drawing to a close, the tax deadlines were approaching. The bills for the imported marble and the luxury cruises were about to come due. The tension in the air was palpable, building toward an inevitable, catastrophic collision. I did not waste time arguing with ghosts. I deal strictly in hard facts. 3 days after my mother and sister called to mock my inheritance, I initiated the next phase of my plan. I packed the royal seal into a reinforced biometric travel case. I secured the case to my wrist using a steel security tether concealed beneath the sleeve of my winter coat. I do not rely on hope or luck. I rely on meticulous preparation. I boarded an early morning flight to New York City. The city was a maze of concrete and ambition, the perfect backdrop for cementing a fortune. The headquarters of the premier international auction house sat on a quiet street on the Upper East Side. The building was imposing, constructed of thick gray limestone, radiating a quiet, intimidating authority. This was not a place for casual browsing. This was an institution where global wealth changed hands behind closed doors. I was escorted past the public galleries and led down a private, heavily guarded corridor into a subterranean vault level. The head of European antiquities stood waiting for me in a climate-controlled examination room. He was a tall, austere man who had spent 4 decades evaluating the lost treasures of fallen empires. I placed the travel case on the steel table. I scanned my fingerprint. The case unlocked with a heavy thud. I unhooked the tether and stepped back, allowing him to approach. He did not gasp. Elite professionals never show immediate emotion. But the moment his eyes registered the chased gold and the old mine-cut diamonds resting on the crimson velvet, the color visibly drained from his face. He picked up his jeweler's loupe, leaned under the high-intensity examination lamp, and studied the maker's marks. Then, he initiated the rigorous authentication protocol. This was the receipt-gathering phase. I sat in a leather chair in the corner of the room and drank black coffee while an entire team of specialists descended on the artifact. They utilized X-ray fluorescence spectrometry to analyze the exact alloy composition of the gold, ensuring it matched the specific metallurgical profile of late 18th century French refining techniques. They brought in senior gemologists to map the irregular facets of the rubies, proving they were cut by hand long before modern laser technology existed. They placed secure international calls to archival historians in Paris to cross-reference the crowned fleur-de-lis hallmark with surviving royal inventories. The process took 6 agonizing hours. The room was tense, filled with hushed whispers and the clicking of specialized cameras. Finally, the lead authenticator walked back into the room, holding a thick manila folder. He closed the heavy oak door behind him. The room fell dead silent. He placed the folder on the table. He looked directly at me and stated that the provenance was flawless. The artifact was the authentic, documented personal seal of King Louis XVI. It was a museum-grade masterpiece that had vanished from the historical record over 2 centuries ago. He handed me the consignment contract. His hands were shaking slightly. He estimated the conservative auction reserve at $4 million for their upcoming autumn marquee sale. Because of the item's unprecedented magnitude, the auction house offered standard VIP terms. an immediate, non-refundable cash advance of $1 million upon signing. I read every single line of the legal document. I picked up a pen and signed my name. With that single stroke of ink, I secured my immediate freedom. I surrendered physical custody of the seal to the auction house vault. I walked back out onto the busy New York streets carrying an ironclad legal contract and a 7-figure wire transfer pending directly to my business account. I flew home the next morning. When my plane landed, my phone connected to the cellular network and immediately began vibrating. It was not a casual text message. It was a barrage of missed calls and an aggressive voicemail from Chloe. I sat in my car in the airport parking garage, turned on the heater, and pressed play. Her voice filled the cabin. The arrogant, mocking tone from 3 weeks ago was gone. It was replaced by a frantic, high-pitched panic. She demanded I come over to the Colonial House immediately. She claimed Patricia was dealing with a minor tax issue and they needed my help sorting out the paperwork because they were suddenly short on cash. She tried to frame it as a temporary inconvenience. It was not a minor issue. It was the inevitable collapse of their financial house of cards. Patricia had made a fatal miscalculation. She treated the legal and financial system like a retail return counter, expecting immediate access to the cash. She neglected to hire a certified public accountant, focusing only on the $1.2 million top line. She failed to realize that the bulk of that money was held in Grandmother Beatrice's traditional IRAs and tax-deferred mutual funds. Because Beatrice had not paid taxes on that money during her lifetime, the IRS was waiting. Attempting to liquidate those massive accounts in a single lump sum to fund their extravagant lifestyle triggered a catastrophic income tax avalanche, pushing Patricia and Chloe into the highest possible federal and state tax brackets. A massive chunk of their inheritance was instantly vaporized by income taxes before they could even touch it. Furthermore, the local municipality had been notified of Beatrice's passing. The county automatically reassessed the property taxes on the Colonial House based on its current inflated market value, stripping away the decades-old senior citizen tax freeze Beatrice had enjoyed. The new property tax bill had arrived in the mail, and it was staggering. The bank holding the line of credit required monthly interest payments. Patricia had drained their personal checking accounts to pay the contractors for the custom marble bathroom. They had no income. They had no accessible cash. They had a massive tax bill and a looming mortgage payment on a house they owned outright just a few weeks prior. Chloe ended the voicemail by screaming into the phone, ordering me to wire them $2,000 by the end of the day to keep the bank from charging late fees. I sat in my car and listened to the dial tone. They were rapidly drowning in the shallow end of their own greed. I deleted the message, put the car in drive, and headed back to my studio. The high-end antique market operates on a foundation of strict discretion, but historical anomalies demand a public spectacle. When an artifact of this magnitude surfaces from the shadows, silence is replaced by calculated theater. The auction house in New York understood the assignment flawlessly. They drafted a masterclass in public relations. Their goal was to generate a frenzy of international interest among private collectors and museums without compromising my identity or my personal safety. They released a digital press kit to global media syndicates early on a Thursday morning. The headline was precision engineered to grab immediate attention. It detailed the upcoming autumn auction of a lost piece of French royal history. But the subtext held the real power. The press release painted a vivid narrative. It described the artifact as being hidden for decades inside the false bottom of an unassuming brass-bound wooden tea caddy. They included high-resolution photographs of the golden seal, showcasing the rubies under brilliant gallery lighting. More importantly, they included a single, stark image of the tarnished box itself. It was the perfect hook. A fairy tale narrative wrapped in a highly lucrative financial package. By Friday evening, the story had trickled down from elite international art publications to regional news syndicates. Local television stations thrive on a hometown angle, even if the primary subject remains anonymous. They framed the upcoming auction as a modern-day treasure hunt happening right under our noses. I watched the 6 o'clock broadcast from the quiet sanctuary of my studio. The scent of binding glue, aged paper, and strong coffee surrounded me. My overhead halogen examination lamps were switched off. The only illumination came from the cool glow of the television monitor mounted on the far wall. The news anchors smiled brightly at the camera, recounting the tale of the dusty heirloom that held a multi-million-dollar secret. I listened to the exact phrasing used by the newscaster. An unremarkable 19th century tea caddy. Heavily oxidized green brass corners. A hidden compartment. While I watched my carefully constructed future unfold on the screen, the walls were rapidly closing in on Patricia and Chloe. Their financial situation had degraded from careless negligence to unadulterated panic. To understand their impending ruin, you have to understand Patricia's lifelong strategy for avoiding consequences. Growing up, I watched my mother manipulate every system she encountered. If she bought an expensive dress for a country club event, she would hide the tags, wear it once, and confidently return it the next day, claiming it was defective. If Chloe failed a class, Patricia would march into the school and charm or intimidate the administration into changing the grade. She believed the rules of the world were malleable, subject to her willpower and social performance. But commercial banks do not care about a suburban matriarch's manufactured charm. The lending institutions holding her massive home equity line of credit operated on cold, automated algorithms. When Patricia missed the first monthly interest payment, the bank generated a standard warning letter. When she missed the second, the system flagged the account. By the third missed payment, the default protocols triggered automatically. The letters arriving at the colonial house were no longer polite requests for communication. They were formal declarations of intent. The reality of property taxes and compounding interest had finally breached their fortress of delusion. Their credit cards were maxed out. Every single line of revolving debt they possessed was tapped dry to fund the imported marble bathroom renovations and the non-refundable deposits on the European river cruises. They had nothing left but an overdrawn checking account and a house they were rapidly losing the legal right to inhabit. The bank drafted a formal notice of intent to place a lien on the property. It was a ruthless legal maneuver that effectively froze their ability to borrow another cent against the estate. This is the exact moment the timelines intersect. It is Friday night. Chloe is sitting in the driver's seat of her pristine, current-year luxury vehicle. She is parked in the driveway of the colonial house. The engine is off because she cannot afford to waste the fuel. She is hiding from her own mother, avoiding the suffocating tension inside the house, where the unpaid bills are stacked high on the kitchen island. She is sitting in the dark, enveloped by the smell of expensive leather she does not actually own. She is scrolling through her social media feed, desperately seeking a temporary escape from the crushing weight of her impending ruin. Her phone screen illuminates her face in the shadowy cabin of the vehicle. The algorithm serves her a sponsored news article shared by a local affiliate. The headline catches her eye. A multi-million-dollar royal artifact discovered inside a worthless antique. She taps the link. The page loads. The first image is a dazzling display of chased gold and flawless gemstones. It means nothing to her. She does not understand history or craftsmanship. But then she scrolls down the page. The second image loads on her screen. It is a high-definition photograph of a 19th century tea caddy. It features heavily oxidized green brass corners. The wood is scratched and dull. The dimensions are identical to the item she laughed at in the estate attorney's office just a few weeks prior. The article details how the anonymous seller inherited the box from a relative, believing it to be a piece of junk, only to uncover a hidden compartment containing a fortune. The breath leaves Chloe's lungs. The description is too specific. The visual evidence is undeniable. She uses her thumb to zoom in on the image of the box, staring at a distinct deep scratch near the front clasp. It is the exact same scratch she saw when the lawyer pushed the item across the mahogany table toward me. The realization hits her with the force of a physical blow. The worthless dirt they had mopped, the dusty heirloom they had practically thrown at my head out of sheer spite, was the golden ticket. They had surrendered a $4 million masterpiece because they lacked the patience to look beneath the surface. The magnitude of their catastrophic mistake washes over her in a wave of paralyzing dread. She realizes they gave away the one asset that could have saved them from the mountain of debt they just created. They handed me the weapon of their own destruction. Sitting in a luxury vehicle that the repo men will soon collect, staring at a phone bill she cannot pay, Chloe connects the dots. Grandmother Beatrice had set a brilliant, devastating trap, and they had sprinted directly into it, dragging their credit scores and their future down into the abyss. I do not need to be sitting in the passenger seat to know exactly how it happened. I know my sister. I know the precise moment her manufactured entitlement fractured into desperate, scrambling panic. Back in my studio, the television anchor wraps up the segment with a lighthearted joke about checking the attic for hidden treasure. I reach out and turn off the monitor. The room plunges back into silence. I stand up from my chair and walk over to my reinforced steel filing cabinet. I run my fingers along the smooth metal edge. Inside rests the ironclad consignment contract from New York and the legally binding probate release bearing my mother's signature. My documentation is flawless. My legal standing is bulletproof. The trap my grandmother designed has officially snapped shut. The quiet, methodical phase of this operation is over. I lock the cabinet, place the key in my pocket, and prepare my mind for the incoming storm. They're out of money. They are out of options. And now, they know exactly where the wealth went. The bubble burst on a Tuesday afternoon. The sky over the city was an uncompromising slate gray, matching the cold reality about to enter my workspace. I was seated at my primary examination table, delicately cleaning the intricate internal gears of a 19th century pocket watch. The rhythmic, tiny ticking of the mechanism was the only sound in the room. Then, the heavy glass door at the ground floor entrance rattled violently. I heard the sharp, urgent voice of my receptionist echoing up the stairwell, telling someone they needed an appointment. Heavy, frantic footsteps pounded against the hardwood treads. The heavy oak door to my private studio swung open with such force that the brass handle dented the drywall. My mother and sister stood in the threshold. The visual contrast between this moment and our last meeting in the law office was staggering. 3 weeks ago, they wore an armor of smug superiority. Today, they look like casualties of war. Chloe wore dark, oversized sunglasses indoors, her designer trench coat hastily tied, her posture rigid with panic. Patricia clutched a leather handbag against her chest like a shield, her face pale, the meticulously maintained facade of the suburban matriarch fracturing under the weight of impending ruin. They did not wait for an invitation. Chloe marched across the room, bypassing the client chairs, and slammed both of her hands onto the edge of my workbench. The impact made my specialized tools rattle. She did not bother with a greeting. She launched directly into a rehearsed, frantic monologue. She demanded I hand over the wooden tea caddy. She claimed she had just spoken to a legal expert. She insisted the estate attorney made a catastrophic clerical error during the reading. According to her new, fabricated narrative, Grandmother Beatrice intended for the heirloom to be shared equally among all the women in the bloodline. She ordered me to retrieve the item immediately so they could take it to a broker of their choosing and split the auction proceeds. I did not flinch. I did not drop the delicate silver watch. I calmly placed the timepiece on a velvet resting pad, removed my jeweler's loop, and looked up at her. I said nothing. My silence infuriated her. Chloe raised her voice, the pitch growing shrill. She accused me of hiding family assets. She pointed a shaking finger at my face, stating that keeping the artifact was a crime. She painted herself as the rightful owner who was being robbed by a greedy, jealous sibling. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of my table. When my lack of reaction became apparent, Patricia stepped forward. She took a slow, deliberate breath. Her shoulders, previously rigid with panic, suddenly slumped. She reached out and placed a trembling hand on Chloe's shoulder, gently pulling her back. Patricia turned her gaze to me, her eyes instantly red and welling up with tears. She let a single drop fall down her pale cheek. When she spoke, her voice was a fragile, cracking whisper. It was the exact same tone she used at the kitchen table 15 years ago, weeping softly into her hands until my father finally agreed to work double shifts at the factory just to cover the mortgage she had neglected to pay. She sobbed that the family was drowning in a sudden, unexpected financial crisis. She blamed the automated banking algorithms, the aggressive tax assessors, the unforgiving economy, everyone but her own choices. She wept about grandmother Beatrice's colonial house, claiming the lending institution was preparing to place a lien on our shared heritage. She begged me to understand that selling the seal was the only possible way to save the family home from foreclosure. She pleaded, staring at me with those wide red eyes, insisting it was my duty as a daughter to step up and fix this tragedy. It was a pathetic, transparent display. They were attempting to force me back into the role of the obedient utility, the reliable workhorse who always sacrificed her own stability to patch the holes in their sinking ship. I remained perfectly still in my chair. I felt the solid oak armrests beneath my palms. I grounded myself in the physical reality of the room, refusing to be pulled into their emotional hurricane. I let them perform. The silence in the studio acted like a vacuum, drawing out their worst impulses. Because I refused to argue, they had to keep talking to sustain the conflict. Chloe pivoted from the fabricated clerical error to outright threats. She paced the floor, her heels clicking rapidly against the wood. She threatened to call the police. She threatened to hire a ruthless litigator to drag me through the civil courts until I was bankrupt. She threatened to ruin my professional reputation by telling every auction house in the country that I dealt in stolen goods. Patricia continued to sob, interjecting with pleas about family loyalty, blood ties, and the memory of my grandmother. She said Beatrice would be ashamed of my selfishness. I let them scream. I watched them exhaust their arsenals. I observed their faces turning red, their breathing growing ragged. Defending yourself against manipulative people only validates their premise. If you argue the facts, you agree that the matter is up for debate. I knew there was no debate. I focused on the smell of impending rain drifting through the cracked window, the steady ticking of the antique clocks lining my walls, the undeniable truth that I held the power. Minutes dragged on. The energy in the room began to shift. The echoing shouts slowly faded into heavy, desperate panting. Chloe stopped pacing. Patricia wiped her eyes, her tears drying up when she realized they were having zero effect on my composure. They stared at me, waiting for the capitulation that had always followed their outbursts in the past. But the capitulation never came. The psychological leverage they had relied on for 31 years was broken. I was no longer the child desperate for their approval. I was not the young adult seeking a place in their manufactured hierarchy. I was a professional, sitting in a fortress of my own making, holding all the cards. They looked at my calm expression and realized they had hit a brick wall. The realization settled over them like a heavy winter chill. They were finally crashing into the consequences of their own actions, and their emotional manipulation had lost its currency. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I stood up from my leather chair. The sudden movement made them both step back. I walked across the hardwood floor toward the reinforced steel filing cabinet resting in the far corner of my studio. The air in the room felt suffocating, heavy with the weight of their manufactured panic. I pulled a small brass key from my pocket, inserted it into the lock, and turned the cylinder. The mechanism engaged with a sharp, metallic click. I pulled open the heavy top drawer. Inside rested a single manila folder containing the architecture of my vindication. I retrieved the file, walked back to my primary examination table, and laid it flat on the smooth surface. I flipped the cover open. The overhead lighting illuminated the crisp white pages and the dark, precise ink. I slid the first document across the table, stopping it directly in front of my mother. It was the official probate release form provided by the estate attorney. I pointed to the bottom of the page. Right there, next to the date, was Patricia's signature in her sweeping, cursive handwriting. I kept my tone flat, devoid of any sympathy or anger. I reminded her of the exact moment she signed that piece of paper. She had been sitting in the leather chair in the law office, practically vibrating with excitement, eager to finalize her access to the mutual funds. She had neglected to read the fine print. She never read the fine print. Throughout my childhood, she signed loan agreements and credit card applications without a second thought, expecting my father or the universe to handle the consequences. I read the highlighted paragraph aloud. She had explicitly waived all legal rights, claims, and interests regarding the 19th century wooden tea caddy and its enclosed contents. By attempting to insult me in front of the lawyer, she had legally severed her own access to the wealth. Patricia stared at her own signature. Her jaw went slack. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her face a pale, ashen mask. She reached out with a trembling finger, hovering over the blue ink, but she refused to touch the paper. She recognized the finality of her own handwriting. Before she could form a cohesive sentence, I slid the second document across the table. It was the consignment contract from the New York auction house. The heavy cardstock was embossed with the crest of one of the most prestigious antiquity dealers on the planet. I tapped the line detailing the item description. It clearly stated my name as the sole, undisputed legal owner of the 18th century French royal seal. I moved my finger down the page. To the estimated reserve price of $4 million, and then explicitly tapped the execution clause. It detailed the $1 million cash advance that had already cleared into my bank account. The digits stared back at them, printed in stark black ink. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. The tears she had weaponized just moments earlier vanished, replaced by a hollow, vacant shock. I informed her that the estate was officially settled. Her signature was binding under state law. I told her the artifact was no longer sitting in my studio. There was no item for them to confiscate. The seal was resting inside a biometric vault 3 states away, guarded by armed security personnel and backed by international insurance policies. There was no clerical error. There was no hidden loophole to exploit. The transaction was final, and they had zero legal standing to contest it. Chloe shattered the silence. Her composure fractured into a million jagged pieces. She let out a guttural, raw scream that echoed off the brick walls of my studio. She slammed her hands against the side of her head, her manicured nails digging into her scalp, ruining her carefully styled hair. She began pacing frantically back and forth, her voice cracking as she shouted that the situation was unfair. She yelled that they needed the money, that the bank was preparing to take the colonial house, that the repo men were circling her luxury vehicle. She demanded I cancel the auction immediately and wire the eventual funds directly into their joint checking account. She operated under the delusion that screaming louder would alter reality. For her entire existence, throwing a tantrum had yielded tangible results. If she cried long enough, Patricia always stepped in and fixed the problem. Chloe expected the universe, the legal system, and the antique market to operate the exact same way. I let her scream until her lungs gave out. I stood there, unmoving, watching the reality of her impending poverty crush her spirit. Then I spoke. I did not insult them. I did not call them greedy, foolish, or arrogant. Emotions are subjective, but facts are impenetrable. I simply stated the cold reality of their choices. I reminded them that less than a month ago, they walked out of a high-rise office building with $1.2 million in liquid assets and the deed to a massive debt-free suburban home. They were handed a generational fortune on a silver platter. I pointed out that they chose to leverage that home. They chose to drain their unearned future to buy luxury vehicles, imported marble countertops, and European river cruises. They spent money they did not possess to impress neighbors they did not like. They squandered a lifetime of financial security in a matter of weeks. I told them their financial ruin was not my responsibility. It was the direct, undeniable result of their own hubris. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but no sound materialized. She looked at the legal documents, then at the heavy oak door, then back at me. She looked deflated, stripped of the suburban armor she had worn for decades. The false narrative they had built around my role in the family was dead. They could no longer pretend I was the broken, dependent scapegoat meant to serve their whims. I was the architect of my own survival, and they were standing defenseless inside my fortress. I placed the documents back into the manila folder and closed the cover. The sound of the paper slapping together snapped Chloe out of her rant. I picked up my cell phone from the workbench. I told them they had exactly 1 minute to exit my studio and leave the premises. I stated clearly that if they did not walk out the door, I would dial the local precinct and have them escorted out in handcuffs for trespassing and harassment. I locked eyes with Patricia. She recognized the terrifying calm in my voice. She knew I was not bluffing. The era of empty threats and family guilt trips had ended. She reached out and grabbed Chloe by the arm. Chloe tried to pull away, still muttering frantic, fragmented sentences about fairness and hiring ruthless litigators, but Patricia dug her fingers into my sister's designer trench coat. She dragged Chloe toward the exit. They stumbled out the door, their footsteps heavy and uncoordinated as they descended the wooden stairwell. The glass door at the ground floor slammed shut, rattling the frame. I stood in the quiet studio, holding the folder. The suffocating presence of their entitlement vanished, replaced by the steady ticking of the antique pocket watch on my table. I had delivered the final strike, severing the toxic tether that had bound me to them for 3 decades. Now, there was nothing left to do but watch the hammer fall on their consequences. 6 months later, during the highly anticipated autumn sale, I sat high above the main floor of the New York auction house in a private, glass-enclosed viewing box. The room below was a theater of immense wealth. Rows of velvet chairs were filled with international collectors, museum curators, and anonymous proxies holding mobile phones. The air smelled of expensive wool suits and polished mahogany. I sipped a glass of sparkling water. My pulse was steady. I was not nervous. The hard work was already done. The auctioneer stepped up to the podium. He was a master of his craft, wielding a wooden gavel like a conductor's baton. When lot number 47 appeared on the digital screens flanking the stage, a hushed murmur rippled through the crowd. The 18th century French royal seal rotated slowly inside a secure illuminated glass display case. The old mine-cut diamonds fractured the gallery spotlight into 1,000 tiny prisms. The opening bid was set at $2.5 million. A paddle went up in the third row. Then a phone bank operator raised a hand. $3 million, 3.2. The numbers climbed with dizzying speed. It was not a chaotic shouting match. It was a precise, calculated exchange of nods and subtle gestures. Each increment represented hundreds of thousands of dollars. I watched the digital conversion board cycle through euros, pounds, and yen. The bidding crossed the 4 million mark. The room grew very quiet. It was down to 2 buyers. A proxy on a secure phone line from Geneva and a private collector seated near the front aisle. The auctioneer leaned into his microphone. He asked for $4.2 million. The phone proxy nodded to the operator. The private collector hesitated, then lowered his paddle. The auctioneer scanned the room one last time. He raised the wooden gavel. It struck the sounding block with a sharp, resonant crack. Sold! $4.2 million. I exhaled slowly. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was the sound of a permanent foundation being poured. My future was instantly, irrevocably secured. Subtracting the auction house commission and pending capital gains taxes, the net proceeds would easily fund my business expansion and secure my early retirement. I signed the final release documents in a quiet back office, walked out into the crisp Manhattan air, and hailed a taxi. While I was building a fortress, the structure my mother and sister had constructed out of vanity and debt was collapsing into dust. The timeline of their financial negligence finally intersected with legal reality. The bank holding the massive home equity line of credit did not wait for a miracle. Commercial lenders do not operate on empathy. They operate on schedules. When the 90-day delinquency window closed, the bank executed their legal right. A process server arrived at Grandmother Beatrice's colonial house on a Tuesday morning. He did not knock softly. He handed Patricia a thick manila envelope containing a formal notice of default and the official recording of a property lien. The county tax assessor followed suit, filing a secondary judgment for the unpaid, reassessed property taxes. The house was locked down. They could not sell it. They could not borrow another dime against it. The imported marble sitting in crates in the dining room would never be installed. Chloe's reality check arrived 2 nights later. She was asleep in her childhood bedroom. Around 3 a.m, a heavy diesel engine idled outside the house. The flashing amber lights of a stealth tow truck illuminated the front windows. By the time Chloe woke up, ran down the stairs, and threw open the front door in her pajamas, it was too late. The driver had already secured the axle of her pristine luxury SUV. He did not argue with her. He simply handed her a printed repossession order, climbed into his cab, and drove away. She stood barefoot in the empty driveway, shivering in the cold night air, staring at the oil stain left behind on the concrete. The endless bailouts were permanently suspended, and the real world had arrived to collect its dues. Stripped of their assets and drowning in the wreckage of their own choices, they attempted one final, desperate maneuver. They tried to rewrite history. Patricia initiated a coordinated phone campaign to our extended family. She called my aunts, uncles, and cousins. She spun a fabricated tale of betrayal. She painted herself as the grieving daughter who was swindled by a calculating, greedy child. She claimed I had stolen a priceless family heirloom out from under them while they were paralyzed by grief, keeping the millions for myself while leaving them destitute and on the verge of homelessness. She expected the family to rally around her. She expected the chorus of relatives to shame me into sharing the auction proceeds. She forgot about Aunt Vivian. Vivian is my father's older sister. She is a retired forensic accountant, a woman who built a career dissecting financial fraud. She does not deal in gossip. She deals in ledgers. Vivian had attended the initial reading of the will. She had sat quietly in the corner of the lawyer's office, observing every smirk, every insult, and every arrogant demand my mother and sister made. When Patricia called Vivian and launched into her victim narrative, Vivian did not offer sympathy. She stopped my mother mid-sentence. Vivian calmly stated the facts. She reminded Patricia that she had explicitly mocked the wooden box and voluntarily signed away her legal rights to it in front of multiple witnesses. Then, Vivian brought out her own receipts. She detailed the exact timeline of Patricia's spending. She mentioned the lavish river cruise deposits, the absurd luxury car purchase, and the massive home equity loan taken out before the crippling income and property taxes were even calculated. Vivian told my mother that her financial ruin was a masterclass in profound arrogance. She stated clearly that I did not steal anything. I simply picked up the item they willingly threw away. The conversation did not end privately. Vivian relayed the truth to the rest of the extended family. The false narrative collapsed before it could even gain traction. The social isolation was immediate and total. My mother and sister were cut off from the sympathy they craved. They were left with a staggering mountain of debt, a foreclosed house, and the agonizing, inescapable knowledge that they had literally handed over a $4 million fortune just to deliver a petty insult. The morning air in my backyard smells of damp earth and blooming jasmine. I sit on the wooden deck I built with my own hands, holding a mug of black coffee, watching the early sunlight filter through the leaves of a massive oak tree. The only sound is the quiet rustle of the wind and the distant chirp of a cardinal. My phone rests on the wrought iron patio table. It does not buzz with frantic demands. It does not ring with manufactured emergencies. The screen is dark, quiet, and peaceful. Today, I run my own independent appraisal firm. I moved my operations out of the dusty commercial district and purchased a bright, open gallery space downtown. I employ a staff of 3 junior appraisers whom I am training to look past the superficial polish of the world. My business thrives because I deal in verifiable truth. Clients bring me their family heirlooms, their estate collections, their forgotten attic discoveries, and I tell them exactly what those items are worth. Sometimes they are disappointed to learn a shiny piece of jewelry is just glass and brass, but more often they are astonished to discover the genuine history resting in their hands. I bought this small, beautiful home with a portion of the funds from the auction. It is not a sprawling suburban colonial. It does not have imported marble countertops or a multi-car garage to house luxury vehicles. It is a modest, single-story craftsman house with sturdy bones and a wraparound porch. I spend my weekends tending to the garden out back. I plant perennial flowers because they require patience, deep roots, and long-term care. They do not offer instant, flashy gratification. They build their strength below the surface, returning year after year, weathering the harsh seasons. It is a fitting environment for the life I have chosen to cultivate. I am entirely removed from the toxicity of my past. My mother and sister do not speak to me. Following the repossession of Chloe's vehicle and the bank placing a permanent lien on grandmother Beatrice's house, they were forced into a brutal downsizing. They currently rent a cramped, 2-bedroom apartment on the opposite side of the state. The extended family, informed of the cold facts by Aunt Vivian, politely distanced themselves. Patricia and Chloe are living the exact reality they constructed through their own arrogance. To some people, family estrangement sounds like a tragedy. Society pushes a narrative that blood ties require endless loyalty, no matter how much damage is inflicted along the way. People often ask me if the silence hurts. They ask if I miss them during the holidays or if I feel a sense of loss. I do not. The silence is the greatest gift they could have ever given me. When you spend 3 decades serving as a human utility, patching the holes in a sinking ship while the captain blames you for the water, stepping off the boat is not a tragedy. It is a rescue mission. I realize that a boundary is not just a defensive weapon. It is not merely a brick wall you build to keep bad actors out of your yard. A boundary is a poured concrete foundation. You cannot construct a stable, peaceful life on the shifting sands of unearned guilt and endless financial bailouts. You have to draw a hard line in the dirt and decide what you will allow into your space. By walking away, I poured the foundation for my own future. Grandmother Beatrice understood this fundamental truth better than anyone. She spent the final years of her life sitting in her quiet sunroom, watching her daughter and her youngest granddaughter measure human worth by price tags and superficial status. She saw them discard anything that did not offer immediate, shallow validation. She also saw me. She watched me sand down old wood, study the hallmarks of forgotten metals, and build my own life, brick by brick. Beatrice knew that true wealth is not about what you are handed on a silver platter. True wealth is possessing the vision to recognize profound value where others only see dust. She did not just leave me a royal artifact. She left me a psychological mirror. The tarnished 19th century tea caddy was a reflection of the beholder. Patricia and Chloe looked at the heavy wood and the oxidized brass, and they saw a worthless burden. They saw an ugly object that required effort to understand, so they tossed it aside. They treated the heirloom the exact same way they treated me. But Beatrice knew I would look closer. She gave me the means to break free, hidden in a language only I could read, and I took it. People ask if I have forgiven them. They assume healing requires reconciliation, that moving forward means unlocking the front door and letting the hurricane back into the living room. That is a dangerous myth. Forgiving my mother and sister does not mean allowing them access to my life, my time, or my resources. It means untying the rope. It means letting go of the heavy, suffocating anchor of resentment. Holding on to anger requires energy. It means allowing them to occupy space in my mind when they no longer have access to my reality. I prefer to spend my energy tending to my garden, expanding my business, and enjoying the profound quiet of a Sunday morning. I forgave them by accepting exactly who they are and then walking in the opposite direction. That is my story. It is a story about the true cost of arrogance and the undeniable power of knowing your own worth. It is proof that sometimes the greatest treasures are disguised as the things other people throw away. Looking back at the past year, the transition from that suffocating mahogany law office to the quiet peace of my own appraisal gallery feels less like a shift in circumstance and more like waking up from a long, strange dream. I often keep a small, polished piece of cedar on my desk as a quiet nod to the box that changed my life. The dust has settled. The auction proceeds are securely invested. My mother and sister remain in their cramped apartment, living out the reality of the choices they made. When you survive a family dynamic built on extraction and manipulation, walking away isn't just about survival. It is an education. The process of dismantling their control taught me more about human nature than decades of studying history. I learned to navigate the world differently, guided by 5 distinct truths. First, true value rarely announces itself. The most precious items in my gallery are often the ones covered in decades of grime, while the shiny, immaculate pieces are frequently cheap reproductions. Grandmother Beatrice knew this applied to people too. She recognized that a quiet, steady work ethic holds far more worth than a loud, performative display of status. Second, greed always built its own cage. I didn't have to bankrupt my mother and sister. They did it themselves. When you operate on the assumption that you are entitled to the world, you lose the discipline required to maintain it. Their desperation for instant gratification blinded them to the impending tax bills and loan defaults. They sprinted toward their own ruin, convinced they were winning a race. Third, facts neutralize emotional manipulation. For years, my family used tears, guilt trips, and manufactured panic to force my compliance. When I stopped arguing and simply presented the signed probate release and the ironclad consignment contract, their power evaporated. You cannot negotiate with a piece of paper that bears your own signature. Documentation is the ultimate defense against people who try to rewrite history. Fourth, silence is a devastating response. When Chloe and Patricia ambushed my studio, they expected a screaming match. They needed me to engage so they could feel justified in their anger. By remaining perfectly still and letting them exhaust themselves against a brick wall of silence, I stripped them of their leverage. Refusing to play the game is the only way to win it. Finally, biology does not equal loyalty. Blood dictates your starting point, but it does not mandate your destination. Grandmother Beatrice was my family because she saw me, understood me, and protected my future. My mother and sister were just relatives who happened to share an address. You have the right to curate the people in your life, preserving those who bring you peace and locking the door on those who bring you chaos. My name is Harper, and I am the architect of my own life. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, or if any of these 5 truths resonated with your own journey of drawing hard lines in the sand, drop a 100 in the comments below. Let me know which lesson hit closest to home. I read every single one because I know exactly how heavy that journey is. Be sure to hit the like button and subscribe to Sweet Karma Life for more stories about surviving toxic dynamics and claiming the peace you deserve. Keep building your foundation, trust your own value, and I will see you in the next video.